Last Sunday was Mother's Day, and in a culture that can no longer even define the term woman, Mother's Day is a bit of an anachronism. It's a day that reminds us of some things that we intuitively know beyond a shadow of a doubt, but it's a day that points out just how much nonsense has emerged in our culture. So let's consider mothers. The Washington Post, one of the progressive newspapers of record in our country, ran an op-ed the week before Mother's Day last week, an article written by two dads, two men in a homosexual partnership who have an adopted 3.5-year-old daughter. She announced one day for them, sort of out of the blue, that she needed a mother. And she declared one of them to be mother, complete with pronoun changes and everything that accompanies that. The article was these two men grappling with this seemingly innate understanding on the part of a 3-year-old that something was not right in her family life, and what was missing she identified as a mother. She simply identified one of the dads to play the role and changed her the way she spoke because she was trying to create, as best a 3-year-old can understand, she was trying to create an experience of family life that meshed with what she felt, how she's hardwired as a tiny human being. In this article, they worried and fretted about the atmosphere. Initially, they went along with this. They thought it was a game of pretend. And so one of the dads, the designated mommy, played along and took on all the titles and the pronouns and the appropriate terms. But they were, in this article, struggling to figure out how to process this. They understood that there was something that they had missed. In fact, they say in the article that they had done everything to prepare themselves for this moment. Our daughter wanted a mommy, so she picked one of her dads. They conceded that they had prepared for this because they had armed themselves with a library of children's books about two fathers and all the things about how to define a family any way that you want to. They thought they were prepared for this conversation. And yet, the big lesson as they struggled, that's another part of this, they decided after they tried to work through what they thought was going to be a temporary situation, they asked this question of themselves: what about non-binary parents who aren't reflected in the mom-dad dichotomy? They went on to observe that in their liberal East Coast community, there was still too much of what they called unnecessary gendering. Do you see what's happening here? A 3-year-old understands the reality of the way mankind is hardwired, the way we were created. And she yearns for that because even in her level of maturity at the age of 3, she recognizes that what her family looks like doesn't match what she intuitively believes and feels to be the expected model. And instead of grappling with the child to try and process these inherent understandings of human relationships, they're caught off guard, off in the ditch somewhere, talking about the opinions of other non-binary parents and what their family life will say to the larger culture. They're missing it all. The big lesson here is that the 3-year-old sees what the adults will not see. I mean, she's not wrong. In fact, her instinct is exactly right. She needs a mommy and a daddy, and she knows it. Our society is committing a form of insanity by trying to argue out loud that two daddies are just fine. They're not just fine, and the radical redefinition of the family is a disaster that's heading toward a cultural catastrophe. We've got to look at these kind of incidents, these kinds of episodes, these arguments, and realize that the fact that this article even appeared in the Washington Post the week before Mother's Day tells us just about everything that we need to know about the progressive left. That is, that the dominant media class centered in Washington, D.C., is still about the business of trying to hammer us with what we're supposed to think, in contrast to what we intuitively understand because we get what it means to be human. Well, the government is doing this in lots of ways. There's the propaganda arm of the government, which is the mainstream media, but it's also a legislative approach. In 1972, the United States government passed a law that's called Title IX. It was designed to secure educational opportunities for American girls and women. It especially had sections related to the parity of dollars spent for women's sports versus men's sports. Many universities had to do away with men's sports that were less profitable so they could set aside dollars to bring women's sports up to par. It was a piece of legislation designed originally under a feminist push, but designed to carve out equal spaces so that women could have the opportunities, both in education and in athletics, that had, in many cases, been reserved for men. Now, what's happened in the ensuing generation is that Title IX has been a political football that has been punted back and forth from one end of the field by succeeding presidencies. What was approved in 1972 was revised under President Barack Obama. It was revised again in the opposite direction under President Donald Trump, and it has now been revised yet again under President Joe Biden. What that means is something that was put in place a generation ago is now something that really hinges on whichever party happens to have the White House. Now, why is that important? Because Title IX in 1972, in effect, was the crowning achievement to that moment for the entire women's rights movement. It was designed to bring parity and equality in dollars spent, in resources utilized to allow women to have educational athletic opportunities. The problem is, in 1972, nobody in any direction was confused about the idea that sex somehow means gender identity. The new changes have opened effectively every locker room, every dorm room, every bathroom, every housing accommodation to anyone who simply self-identifies as a woman, regardless of their underlying biology. In other words, what the government is now saying is that you can have access to any space that has been traditionally reserved for a woman if you just announce that you're a woman. We've seen extreme examples all the way down to middle school where middle school girls on overnight field trips have been forced to room with middle school boys who identify as girls. Men competing in women's athletic sports. There's a recent race that I read about in college sports where a male pretending to be a female won a medal displacing a biological woman from the medal stand. And it turns out if he had been running in the same men's race, in the same track meet, his winning score in the women's race would have come in dead last in the men's race of the same event. Well, if you have no compunction about how you get a medal with your name on it, then just announce that for the day you're a woman and go run against the weaker field of competition. Well, the pastor, that undermines his identity, his feelings about himself. No, it doesn't undermine anything. What it does is you have effectively told women in an almost pre-1972 attitude, you've told women that they no longer matter. In fact, They can be replaced simply by a man announcing that he's going to take over. When 3-year-old children look at our culture and say, this is not how we live, we need to wake up. Those two dads said something in the article about being concerned about heteronormality. We've talked about this before, folks. We have to actually invent fancy new words to try and bring organization to the nonsensical thinking that is dominating our culture. Heteronormality? Who talks that way? What they mean is they're embarrassed that their 3-year-old knows better than they do about what a real family looks like. How do we approach this biblically? Well, I shouldn't have to make this case. All we should do is read this verse. This should settle the issue right here. In Genesis chapter 1, beginning in verse 26, it simply says, "Then God said, let us make mankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every crawling thing that crawls on the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth, and subdue it, and rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." You see, there is a designer, and he made a design. And we have rejected the simple, straightforward, and obvious reality that is God's creation. God said, let's make man and woman, male and female, in our image. And then he turned around and immediately gave them this command, this charge: be fruitful and multiply. It is not an implication that says a marriage without children is a false marriage. That's not what these verses mean. But it does mean that a partnership without even the cultural expectation or awareness that reproduction is a possibility is not a marriage relationship that is a part of the original design. You don't have to have children to have a viable marriage as between a man and a woman. But any relationship that doesn't have the physical capabilities or possibilities. I understand infertility and all those kinds of things, but my point is, when you take two parts and put them together, and those parts by definition cannot fulfill the original charge given for marriage, it disqualifies that relationship for a marriage. Well, Pastor, why can't people just love whoever they want to love? I get that question sometimes, and here's the problem with it. It is such a hollow and shallow definition of love that it virtually makes no sense. Why can't everybody just love whoever they love? They can, but when you understand what the word love means, we wouldn't apply it in such flippant ways. Do I hurt for people that have these kinds of same-sex attractions? Yes, I do. I understand how difficult that is. We live in a broken world. But the solution to those struggles is not for culture to radically redesign the family. In fact, the reality of things is the Creator intended for a man to marry a woman and for the family to be the most foundational unit of society, with children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren and on and on and on. Every family reflecting the glory of God and centered in a unique and monogamous conjugal union of a man and a woman, united in the covenant of marriage and faithfully open to the gift of children. Our society is now at war with the creation order conception that came from the mind of God regarding marriage and family. We celebrated Mother's Day last week. That's a reminder that we've had to make some cultural accommodations in our generation. But while Mother's Day points out the absurdities of so much around us, there is still something in that holiday that calls to us. And in truth, it reminds us that we don't need to accommodate God's design to fit our brokenness. What we're actually longing for is the presence of the glory of God to take our brokenness and bring us in alignment with the grand design that God so graciously has mapped out for us. Articles like this one in the Washington Post just underline the insanity of our times and the stakes of the struggle. Will we dismantle the created order to accommodate the brokenness of the human condition? Or will we find our way back to the Word of God and let our broken condition be renewed so that once again we live in harmony with the order of the one who designed us precisely in ways that were best for us? Quit looking the other way. Quit hiding from this conversation. We are not wrong about our attitudes of two genders, male and female. The Bible is very clear. Let's just graciously and with kindness stand firm and refuse to back down. Even the 3-year-olds know the truth. If we could just stand with the littlest among us and proclaim that truth to a culture that is jumping through intellectual hoops, doing mental gymnastics to believe nonsense. We can't accept it. We won't allow it. And we won't stay silent. This is Truth Currents.